Four members of the Mullins family set off for a weekend trip in Yosemite's Graypine Valley, but they never returned. For 15 years, not a single trace was found, until a sheriff's team dragged a rusted truck from beneath a frozen lake, revealing a scene that would change everything. Sheriff Nathan Cross stood at the edge of Lake Merrow, his breath visible in the brittle morning air. The ice groaned beneath the deputies' boots as they strained with cables and pulleys, the sound echoing across the hollow like bones snapping. The pickup truck, blackened with rust and frozen in layers of ice, broke free of the lake bed with a slow, terrible shriek. Water spilled from its doors as it rose, green and foul with silt. Nathan braced himself, jaw tight, as the vehicle finally thudded onto the frozen reeds. For 15 years, the lake had hidden its secret, but now it had surrendered its dead. The deputies backed away as if the truck itself might lunge at them. Nathan forced his boots forward, each step crunching through a skin of ice. The metallic stink of rust and old blood cut through the cold, making his stomach tighten. He pulled on a pair of gloves, his fingers trembling not from the weather, but from a dread he dared not voice. "Sheriff," one deputy called, his voice unsteady. "Do we open it?" Nathan didn't answer at first. He pressed a palm to the door, feeling the frozen metal bite through his glove. Then, with a steady breath, he jerked the latch. The door creaked open, brittle ice breaking like glass. A gust of trapped air rushed out, damp and sour, carrying a faint copper tang that made his throat tighten. Inside sat a nightmare. The father's skeleton slumped forward in the driver's seat, ribs bowed, skull split along one side like a dropped jar. Dark stains spread across the seat beneath him, frozen into crusted rivulets. Behind him, two small forms crouched together, their bony jaws frozen open in silent screams, scraps of flannel shirts still hanging from their shoulders. The sight of the children's remains made one deputy stagger back, hand clamped to his mouth. Nathan's chest constricted, but he forced himself closer, his boots scraping against ice-coated carpet. In the passenger seat, the mother's remains leaned sideways. One skeletal arm was drawn across her lap, fingers locked around the hilt of a knife, snapped in half. The blade's jagged edge glinted faintly beneath a layer of frost. Her hand still seemed to be reaching forward, as if she had fought until her final breath. Nathan froze. His mind tried to shape it as an accident, a family trapped, frozen, gone without warning. But the scene rejected that lie. The skull fracture was too sharp, the blood patterns too violent, the knife too desperate. This wasn't fate. It was cruelty. A deputy gagged suddenly, his boots scraping against ice. A small object had slid from beneath the seat, bumping against his leg. He bent down with trembling hands, then recoiled with a choked sound. Nathan stepped closer, squinting at the object lying against the frozen floor. A child's shoe, the size of a boy barely in middle school. The leather was torn, and across the heel ran a thick, dark smear of dried blood. The deputy dropped it like it burnt. "God, Sheriff," his voice cracked. Nathan swallowed hard, his throat raw. For a moment, the sound of the lake filled his ears, the creak of ice, the whisper of reeds swaying in the wind, the hollow silence of the valley. He thought of the stories the town had whispered for years, tales of a family swallowed by wilderness, of poor luck or hungry bears. He knew those stories would die today. What lay before him was no accident. He steadied himself, hand pressed against the cold frame of the truck. The smell of decay clung to his clothes, sharp as iron, and he knew he would never wash it away. His deputies watched him, waiting for words, for certainty. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, as if they too understood the line had shifted. The mystery of the past had become a crime in the present. Nathan stared at the skeletal family one last time, the silent plea in their positions, the frozen horror carved into the scene. His voice came low, strained but steady, carrying across the frozen reeds like a vow. Someone buried them here on purpose. Detective Elias Ward stepped down from the black sedan, his boots crunching into the crusted snow. The night air cut sharp against his lungs, bitter with a mingled sense of oil, wet rust, and something older that clung to the frozen shoreline of Lake Merrow. A line of deputies stood at uneasy attention, their breath fogging in the beams of the floodlights that bathed the scene in pale, artificial daylight. Beyond them, the truck sat half-dragged from the lake, ice clinging to its frame like a shroud. Its windows had cracked under the cold, leaving jagged teeth of glass that caught the light. The silence around it was heavy, broken only by the hum of generators and the soft, reluctant scrape of chains on the ice. Elias tightened his gloves and moved forward, ignoring the murmurs that followed him. His coat snapped in the wind as he ducked beneath the tape and crouched beside the driver's side door. He didn't need to be told what lay inside. The deputies' pale faces said enough. He raised his camera, the mechanical click punctuating the night as he captured the first images. Streaks of frozen blood that spread across torn upholstery, jagged patterns hardened by years beneath the ice. He leaned closer, his breath fogging against the window, and spotted the faint ridges of a fingerprint preserved in the frost. He paused, staring. The print had a clarity impossible for something 15 years old, as if whoever touched it had pressed down just yesterday. He stepped back, shifting his view to the glove compartment. A smear, darker than the surrounding stains, dragged across its metal. Elias reached out with a gloved hand, scraping at it lightly. The texture was brittle, crumbly, but the color made his gut tighten. It wasn't rust. He leaned in, the metallic tang rising faintly even through the cold. Burnt flesh. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, snapping a close photograph before moving on. A deputy approached cautiously, his voice low. "Detective, you might want to see this." He held out two small backpacks, their colors dulled by frost but still intact. Elias set them gently on the hood of a patrol car, unzipping the first. Inside lay scattered pencils, torn notebooks, and at the bottom, a scatter of broken teeth, some still clinging to pale roots. His hand froze over them, his pulse quickening. He zipped it shut quickly, forcing his breath steady. The second bag felt heavier. Inside, pages of a sketchbook were stiff with ice, but the final sheet bore a frantic scrawl in a child's trembling hand. The words jolted him. "He's here." Elias recognized the slant of the letters instantly. Tyler Mullins, the youngest boy. His chest clenched as though the words had been written for him, carried across 15 years to land squarely in his hands. He traced the lines lightly, imagining a 12-year-old hunched in fear, scratching out a warning that no one had ever read. He exhaled slowly and turned to the trunk. With a signal, two deputies lifted it open, the hinges groaning under strain. The lantern beam fell across the contents, a hammer crusted with blood and hair, its weight heavy with violence. A lantern stood staining its glass as if it had burned hard and long in desperate night, and wedged into the lining, almost hidden, a Polaroid photo. Elias slipped it free, brushing frost from the edges. The image struck him like a blow. The Mullins family sat gathered at their campfire, frozen in a moment of fragile warmth. But behind them, in the dark tree-line, a figure stood, blurred but undeniable, tall and gaunt, its shoulders hunched as though waiting. A spark caught the figure's hand, something metallic reflecting firelight. Elias's jaw tightened. His thumb brushed the photograph's edge, careful not to smudge it. He stared long enough to see what no one else had noticed, a shadow not belonging to the family. The floodlights flickered, and a gust of wind rattled the branches overhead. Elias lowered the photo, his eyes drawn to the frozen corpses within the cab. The father slumped forward with his head split open, the mother's skeletal hands still gripping a broken knife, and the boys huddled in the back, jaws stretched in silent terror. His mind pieced together fragments of their last moments. The lantern burning, the children writing, the unseen man watching from the woods. He straightened, his voice low but firm, as though saying it aloud would make it real. "This wasn't random," he muttered. "They were hunted." Floodlights buzzed and cast long beams across the icy lake, turning the fog into a pale shroud. Deputies moved with tense urgency, their boots crunching over brittle reeds as they set up the search perimeter. The sound of radios crackling filled the still night, but Elias Ward tuned it all out. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark shoreline where frost had hardened the soil into a glassy crust. Something had caught his attention, an impression in the earth, faint at first but unmistakable as he drew closer. He crouched, the cold biting his knees through thin trousers, and brushed snow away with gloved fingers. The prints deepened with each step he followed, spaced in long strides. His breath fogged in the air as he leaned down to measure one with his hand. It was broad, heavy, far larger than Henry Mullen's boots or the smaller shoes the boys had worn. Elias's jaw tightened. Whoever left these tracks had been here when the lake swallowed the truck. "Detective?" a deputy called, voice shaking as he approached with a flashlight beam jittering across the ice. "Stay back a moment," Elias answered, his tone low but firm. "Don't disturb the trail." He followed the prints a few yards farther into the trees, the forest looming like an audience of silent giants. There, half buried in hardened snow, a dull gleam caught his eye. Elias dug carefully until his glove brushed cold metal. He pulled free a hunting knife, its blade jagged and dark with corrosion. The initials carved crudely into the wooden handle made his breath catch. "Jam." He whispered the letters aloud, his voice barely audible, as though saying them too loudly would summon their owner back. Returning to the lake bank, Elias carried the knife in an evidence bag, his expression unreadable but his thoughts racing. "Not Mullen," he murmured, eyes narrowing. "Someone else." The truck loomed under the floodlights like a tomb dragged unwilling into daylight. Inside, the air reeked of iron and rot, though most of the bodies had already been moved under tarps. Elias stepped closer to the father's remains, gesturing for a deputy to steady the light. He examined the skull, his stomach nodding. The fracture was too clean, a sharp break that spoke of precision, not accident. He traced the line with his eyes, imagining the force of a heavy blow. "This wasn't a fall," he said grimly. The deputy swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. Then what was it?" "Deliberate," Elias replied, his voice hard. "Someone struck him. Through the glass, maybe." He turned toward the windshield. Hairline cracks fanned outward from a single impact point, splinters of glass still clinging to the frame. Elias could almost see it play out, the family inside, panic rising, the father trying to shield them, and a shadow outside bringing the hammer down, glass exploding into the cabin. His gut twisted as he imagined the boys screaming in the back seat, their world collapsing into chaos. The crime was too neat, too purposeful. Whoever had done this hadn't stumbled upon the Mullens by chance. He had herded them, forced them into the truck, and broken them apart piece by piece before consigning them to the lake. "Detective Ward," another deputy called out, his voice uneasy. "We found something under the driver's seat." Elias turned, his pulse quickening as the deputy approached with a small metal tin, the lid pried loose. He took it with careful hands, the cold container biting into his gloves. Inside, something pale and shriveled curled against the metal. Elias froze. It was a finger severed cleanly at the knuckle, the skin taut and mummified from age. Around it clung a wedding band, dull with rust, but clearly not belonging to Henry or any member of his family. For a long moment, no one spoke. The night hummed with the low drone of the floodlights and the distant groan of shifting ice. Elias stared at the grisly relic, a chill worse than the winter air crawling down his spine. "The killer," Elias whispered, his throat tight, left part of himself behind. By dawn, the shoreline of Lake Merrow was alive with floodlights and the crunch of heavy boots. Cold air snapped against the canvas of tents that federal agents had erected in the night, their voices clipped and commanding as they cordoned off the scene. Elias Ward stood apart, his jaw tight, watching as strangers in dark coats boxed up the Mullens' remains as though they were museum artifacts. His fingers itched with frustration, the Polaroid burning like a coal in his pocket. When one agent moved to collect the small tin containing the severed finger, Elias's hand shot out, gripping it first. "That's evidence," the agent barked, his breath fogging in the cold. "It's mine," Elias said evenly, his eyes narrowed. He held the man's stare until the agent looked away, muttering under his breath before retreating toward the vans. Elias tucked the tin close, his chest rising and falling with restrained anger. 15 years of silence had finally cracked open, and he would not let bureaucracy bury it again. By afternoon, the scene had quieted. Snow drifted lazily from the pines as Elias sat across from Henry Mullins's brother, Raymond, in the sheriff's office. The older man's hands trembled as he clutched a coffee mug, steam curling above his unshaven face. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from the cold or from memories, Elias could not tell. "You're certain Henry mentioned this?" Elias asked, voice steady but probing. Raymond nodded slowly. He said someone was following them. Not just once. Every time they camped out there. Dead animals at their tents, strange cuts on the trees. He thought it was kids playing tricks, but he trailed off, his jaw tightening as his gaze sank into the mug. Henry wasn't the type to scare easy. But that last call, he sounded shaken. Elias wrote quickly in his notebook, each word carving deeper into his suspicion. "And he never mentioned a name?" "No," Raymond whispered, his voice hollow. Only that it felt like the woods themselves were watching. The words lingered long after Elias left the office. As dusk stretched across Graypine, he returned to the forest, guided by instinct and Raymond's account. The path was silent, muffled by thick snow, but the silence pressed against him like a weight. He scanned every tree trunk until he saw it. Faint markings etched deep into the bark. Circles slashed with jagged lines, gouged so violently that the wood had scarred over the years. Elias traced one with gloved fingers, the grooves biting back cold against his skin. Nearby, half buried in the frost, he found a lantern. Its metal was corroded, the glass fractured, yet a faint orange glow trembled weakly inside, flickering like a heartbeat despite the absence of oil. Elias froze, his breath clouding in the cold. No natural fire burned without fuel. He crouched close, his reflection warped in the glass, but the flame gave off no heat. The forest closed around him. Branches creaked overhead, groaning against the weight of ice. Each sound drew his eyes, each shadow stretched too long, as though something moved between the trees, staying just outside the edges of his vision. His pulse quickened, the Polaroid heavy in his coat pocket. He thought of the blurred figure at the tree-lean, the distorted outline that had stood behind the family as their firelight crackled. "You're still here, aren't you?" he muttered, his voice breaking the silence. The words were carried off by the wind, but the pines seemed to lean closer, listening. He pulled the hunting knife from his satchel, the initials JM etched starkly into the handle. Its blade was nicked and jagged, stained by rust that no time could erase. He held it low, the weight grounding him even as unease rippled through his chest. Whoever Jacob Mather was, if he was even real, the knife was proof of a hand that had carved fear into the Mullins' final days. Elias's thoughts tightened like a noose. The family had not died quickly. The symbols, the dead animals, the lantern, these were not accidents or signs of madness. They were stages in a design. A predator had circled them, taunted them, and when the moment was right, dragged them into the black water. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke, though no fire burned nearby. Elias turned slowly, eyes narrowing at the endless dark between the trees. His grip on the knife hardened until his knuckles whitened. He drew a sharp breath, his voice a whisper of certainty and dread. "Whoever you are, you wanted them to suffer." Elias returned to his motel that night, with his hands still cold from the forest air. He dropped his coat over the back of the chair, but his eyes never left the Polaroid on the desk. The picture seemed to hum in the silence of the room. The blurred figure at the tree-lean captured mid-motion, frozen in a way that mocked time. Elias sat heavily on the bed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, watching the photograph as though it might suddenly move. He rubbed at his eyes, but when he looked again, the figure was still there, still waiting. He pulled the borrowed projector from its case and set it up with careful, methodical hands, the way he used to lay out evidence in courtrooms. The hum of the machine filled the room as the photo bloomed across the peeling wallpaper, magnified until every grain of film stood out like scars. Elias stepped closer, his breath shallow. The figure was gaunt, shoulders drawn up as if permanently braced against the cold. His head tilted in a way that suggested he was watching something or someone just beyond the firelight. Elias's eyes narrowed on the object glinting in the man's hand. The reflection caught the flame from a Mullins campfire, flashing silver. A knife? A piece of metal? His mind circled around the possibility of a blade, though the blur made certainty impossible. He reached up and traced the outline on the wall with a fingertip, his skin prickling at the thought. If it was a weapon, the Mullins had been marked the moment this picture was taken. But it was the distortion near the man's feet that gripped Elias hardest. He stepped back, adjusted the focus, and there it was, a second shadow. Smaller, thinner, bending in the firelight at an angle that didn't belong to the Mullins or the trees. He whispered aloud, "There's someone else." His voice cracked in the still air, startling even him. The family had been alone, at least according to every record, every interview, every assumption made 15 years ago. Yet here, on the wall of the motel room, another shape lingered in the dark. Sleep would not come. He lay on the bed, but found his gaze pulled again and again to the projection. Questions clawed through his mind. Was the second shadow a child? An accomplice? Or just an accident of the film? And if it was real, why had no one else noticed it? The unease swelled until he could not stay still. At dawn, long before the town stirred, Elias pulled on his coat and made his way to the records hall. The building smelled of dust and mildew, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. He spread hunting license ledgers across the table, their pages crackling as he turned them. He searched names with the patience of a man who had learned that answers never came quickly. Then he saw it, Jacob Mather. His initials matched the knife recovered from the snow, JM. Elias's heart kicked once, hard against his ribs. He leaned closer, scanning the notes. Mather had been a recluse, an outlier who lived in the woods around Blackwater Valley. He was a name Elias had heard whispered in old case files, tied to petty crimes and strange sightings, but never proven guilty of anything larger. The year the Mullins vanished, Mather had disappeared too. Most assumed he had wandered deeper into the wilderness, lost to the cold or starvation. Yet here was his name staring back at Elias, paired with the knife left at the crime scene. Elias pushed the ledger away and gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles blanched. If Mather had stalked the Mullins, it wasn't chance. The Polaroid, the knife, the shadow, all of it pointed to intent. Elias remembered the uncle's words about a stalker leaving dead animals at campsites, the carved symbols in the trees. A picture of obsession formed in his mind, a hunter circling his prey until the moment he struck. Still, one thought unsettled him more than the rest. The severed finger found in the tin beneath the seat. Elias could see it again, pale and shriveled, the wedding band still clinging to bone. It hadn't been discarded like waste. It had been preserved. He closed his eyes, picturing the tin placed carefully beneath the driver's seat, a hidden trophy waiting to be discovered. That act spoke not of a desperate drifter, but of someone methodical, someone leaving a message. He sat back, the ledger closed before him, and spoke into the quiet room, his voice low, deliberate, and heavy with realization. This wasn't madness, Elias muttered. It was a ritual. Elias pushed through the skeletal branches, his boots grinding the snow with a muffled crunch that seemed louder than it should have been in the dead stillness. The deputies trailed behind him, their breath fogging the air in ragged clouds, the weight of silence pressing heavier with every step. The trail of prints they followed had nearly vanished beneath the snowfall, but here and there Elias spotted the sunken impressions, larger than any of theirs, preserved by the cold. His pulse throbbed in his ears. Whoever had left them wasn't some fading memory. He had walked this path recently. The forest opened suddenly, revealing a clearing swallowed in frost. Old fire pits dotted the soil like scars, their blackened stones rimmed with ice. Elias slowed, raising a hand to halt the deputies. The clearing felt wrong, too deliberate, too still, as if it were waiting for them. He crouched, gloved fingers brushing over a charred ring of stones, brittle ash crumbling at his touch. The cold bit through his coat, but a deeper chill, one that lived under his skin, made his hand tremble. "Sir," one deputy whispered, his voice tight. "Look." Elias turned. Scattered in the frozen soil were bones. Animal at first glance, gnawed and brittle, but among them something smaller, cleaner. He lifted it carefully, holding the pale shard to the light. His breath caught. A child's radius, unmistakable, its end worn as though chewed. The deputies shifted uneasily, their boots crunching backward. Elias's jaw tightened. "This isn't just a campsite," he muttered. "It's a graveyard." Above them, a broken lantern swung from a low branch, its rusted frame creaking in the wind. The glass was cracked and smeared with a dried, brown crust that needed no explanation. Elias stared at it too long, his mind forcing images he didn't want. Screams swallowed by trees, firelight casting shadows across terrified faces. He exhaled hard, forcing his focus back. One of the deputies pointed at a pine near the clearing's edge. Fresh carvings scarred its bark, deep grooves cut into a circle slashed jagged through the middle. Sap bled thick and slow, gleaming like tears against the trunk. Elias stepped closer, running his hand over the sticky ridges. The marks were recent, days old, maybe hours. His throat tightened. Whoever had carved them was not a ghost from the past. He was close. The deputies looked at one another, unease plain in their eyes. "Detective," the older of the two said, voice low, "we shouldn't be here after dark." His hand hovered near his holster, as though the trees themselves might lunge. Elias didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept the clearing, calculating, searching. He had chased countless men, but this was different. This was not just violence. This was ritual. His gut told him that every bone, every mark, was part of a design that had taken years to perfect. Leaving would mean surrendering the truth. And Elias Ward had never walked away from truth. As dusk pulled its long fingers across the valley, Elias's eyes caught on something hidden beneath brush. He motioned silently for the deputies to cover him, then dropped to his knees and pulled away the frozen branches. A shallow pit yawned beneath, and inside lay dozens of Polaroids, warped with moisture, their edges curled, but their subjects still clear. Elias's hands shook as he lifted them one by one. Faces stared back at him. Children, men, families, each captured in the woods, expressions caught between shock and terror. Some were mid-run, some huddled, others staring directly into the camera, their eyes wide with helpless pleading. The deputies hovered behind him, muttering prayers under their breath. Elias's throat closed as he spread the images across the snow. Each one was proof, each one a scream, frozen in silence. His chest burned with the weight of their voices. Then his fingers brushed the final photograph. He froze. It was not a face, not a figure at all, but a severed hand, shriveled with time, the skin blackened at the knuckle. On its finger gleamed a ring, simple, unremarkable, and yet he knew it. The same ring that had stared up at him from the tin hidden beneath the Mullins truck seat. The connection was undeniable. This wasn't a forgotten relic. It was deliberate. A mark. A reminder. His breath came shallow, the cold air stabbing his lungs. The deputies stood pale and silent, one whispering, "What kind of man keeps this?" Elias swallowed hard, his voice rough, almost breaking as he answered, "Not a man." He stared at the Polaroids spread like a grotesque gallery at his knees. His instincts screamed that they were not alone, that unseen eyes lingered just beyond the tree lean, watching, savoring. The wind shifted, carrying a sound like footsteps too heavy to be branches cracking. Elias rose slowly, his hand tightening around his pistol. Every shadow stretched too far, every whisper of wind sounded like breath. The truth of the clearing wrapped around him like chains. Whoever had hunted these people was not gone. He was still here. Elias's breath trembled as the last of the daylight bled away, and the darkness crept closer, swallowing the clearing hole. His voice was barely audible, yet heavy with certainty as he whispered, "He's still out here." Elias Ward sat hunched on the creaking mattress of the Graypine motel, the air thick with the smell of mildew and damp carpet. Every inch of the bedspread was covered with Polaroids, their glossy surfaces catching the pale light of a desk lamp. He moved them like puzzle pieces, his fingers trembling with the fatigue of too many sleepless nights. Outside, wind rattled the thin window pane, making the curtains shiver. Inside, it felt as if the room itself was holding its breath. The detective leaned closer, his shadow spilling across the photos. Each one carried the same pattern. Families frozen mid-terror, children clutching one another, fathers shielding sons, eyes wide with something more than fear. It was recognition. The backdrop of each image unsettled him even more. A rusted water tower, leaning over skeletal trees, a stone bridge long choked by moss, and a jagged cliff face where pines clawed at the sky. "They're not random," Elias whispered to himself, the sound of his own voice a fragile lifeline in the silence. He picked up one photo, holding it beneath the lamp. They were chosen here, brought here. He pulled out a county map and spread it across the floor, pinning the corners with a chair leg, an ashtray, a leather boot. One by one, he laid the photos over it, matching each background to a landmark he remembered from old ranger surveys and case files. His hand slowed as the pattern revealed itself. Each site curved inward, lines of violence converging like rivers toward a single point. Lake Merrow, the very place where the Mullins had been entombed. Elias sat back on his heels, rubbing his tired eyes. His heart thudded, not with the rush of discovery, but with dread. This wasn't a series of scattered crimes. It was territory, a hunting ground mapped with precision. The Mullins hadn't been random victims. They had stumbled into the center of the web. And unlike the others, their truck had been dragged beneath the ice, hidden away as though the killer had wanted them forgotten completely. He thought of the boy's final message in the torn sketchbook. "He's here." Elias could almost see the child's shaking hand scrawling those words by lantern light, knowing a figure stood just beyond the tree line. Perhaps the family had recognized their stalker. Perhaps they had tried to run or threatened to expose him. Killing them wasn't enough. They had to be erased, buried beneath a grave of frozen water. Elias's chest tightened as he picked up another photograph, its edges curled with age. His eyes froze on the image. Around the campfire, flames licking upward, stood a younger version of Sheriff Nathan Cross. He was smiling faintly, a cigarette dangling from his hand, and beside him loomed another man Elias instantly recognized from the case files, Jacob Mather, the recluse, the suspected drifter, the ghost blamed for years of missing people. The detective's pulse spiked. His breath fogged in the cold air of the motel room. Cross had sworn he never met Mather, had claimed ignorance of the man's habits or whereabouts. Yet here he was, captured forever on glossy paper, standing shoulder to shoulder with him like an old companion. "No," Elias muttered, gripping the photo tighter. "That can't be coincidence." He leaned in closer, studying every detail. The sheriff's posture was relaxed, not defensive. His smile wasn't forced. It was familiar. Mather, gaunt and hollow-eyed, had a lantern at his feet and a knife strapped to his belt. The firelight glinted off the blade, the same kind of reflection Elias had seen in another photo of the Mullins' last night alive. Elias slammed the picture down onto the map, his jaw tightening. He thought back to the sheriff's words at the lake, the way Cross's eyes had slid away from the Polaroid with the shadowy figure. The way his voice had caught, just barely, when he said it proved nothing. The detective rose to his feet, pacing the narrow room. "You lied to me," he said aloud, each word a hammer striking steel. "You said you didn't know him. You said you never crossed paths. But you were there. You were part of it." The lamp flickered, straining against faulty wiring. Elias stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on the photograph, his mind racing through every possibility. Had Cross led the family into the valley? Had he covered for Mather all these years, blaming disappearances on accidents and wilderness hazards while standing guard over a predator's ground? The air felt colder, as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening. Elias pressed his palms against the desk, lowering his head. He had always suspected that Graypine was rotting beneath its small-town charm. Now he had proof. He looked back at the firelit image, his own reflection shimmering faintly in the glossy surface. His voice was low, steady, and filled with grim certainty. The sheriff's lying. The office door shut behind them with a muted click, and the morning sunlight slanted through the blinds, striping Sheriff Nathan Cross's desk in pale lines. Detective Elias Ward stood across from him, posture taut, a thin manila envelope gripped in his hand. Without a word, Elias slid the single photograph across the wood, its edges scraping faintly against the grain. The image caught the light, grainy yet unmistakable. Sheriff Cross, years younger, seated at a campfire beside Jacob Mather. Cross's eyes dropped briefly to the photo before he pushed it back with 2 fingers, his expression flat. "That doesn't mean anything," he muttered, voice low and gruff. But Elias noticed how his hand lingered just a moment too long on the edge of the paper, as though resisting the urge to snatch it away. Elias leaned forward, his tone controlled but sharp. "You said you never knew Mather." "Not once. Yet here you are, smiling at his fire. Explain that to me." His voice echoed faintly in the quiet office, broken only by the slow tick of the clock on the wall. Cross shifted back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His jaw tightened, and he straightened his posture, wearing the stern authority of a man used to giving orders. "You're chasing ghosts, detective," he said, his voice colder now, his eyes narrowing. "That picture proves nothing. A trick of the light. Maybe. Could be anyone." But Elias's gaze was locked not on the sheriff's words, but on his body, the bead of sweat tracing down from Cross's temple, catching against the deep lines of his face. Cross raised a hand to wipe it away quickly, too quickly, and Elias knew the denial was an act. The silence stretched long, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elias gathered the photo back into the envelope, his hand steady though his pulse thundered in his chest. "I'll find the truth," he said quietly, almost a promise to himself rather than to the sheriff. That evening, Elias's car rolled slowly down Graypine's back roads, headlights dimmed, tires crunching faintly against gravel. He trailed Cross's patrol vehicle at a careful distance, watching its taillights bob and vanish as it turned onto an unmarked path leading into the forest. Elias killed his engine and stepped out, the night air sharp with pine and frost. His breath came in misty clouds as he followed on foot, boots sinking into damp earth. The forest was alive with subtle sounds, the groan of branches in the wind, the faint rustle of unseen animals, the distant call of an owl. Every step deepened his unease, but determination pressed him forward. Through the trees, Elias caught sight of Cross. The sheriff's broad frame moved slowly, deliberately, until he knelt before a crude stone structure half hidden by roots and brush. Elias crouched low, watching from the shadows. The shrine was rough but purposeful, a circle of stones stacked with care, their faces carved deep with jagged slashes that twisted into crude symbols. Faded wax clung to their surfaces, and several candles burned low, their flames flickering and sputtering against the cold wind. The lantern Cross carried glowed weakly, rusted and blackened by age, yet it cast a haunting light across his bowed head. Cross's lips moved, whispering words Elias couldn't make out. His hands trembled slightly as he set the lantern atop the shrine, the flame within catching and flaring as though feeding on the carved stones themselves. For a moment, the sheriff stayed kneeling, head bent in something that looked uncomfortably like prayer. Elias's heart pounded in his ears. The sheriff hadn't come to patrol, hadn't come to investigate. He was here to worship. The thought hit Elias with cold clarity. Cross wasn't covering for the killer. He was bound to whatever darkness lived in these woods, perhaps leading it. Elias's throat tightened as he crouched deeper into shadow, every instinct screaming to retreat, but his legs held firm. His fingers clenched around the knife handle in his coat pocket, and his mind swirled with the image of the photo, the fire, and the shrine before him. He had always trusted evidence, logic, procedure. Yet what unfolded here in the wilderness was older than reason, darker than law. The sheriff rose slowly, shoulders hunched, and whispered again into the wind. Elias couldn't hear the words, but the sound chilled him. He felt the forest lean closer, as if listening. His hands trembled, but his thoughts sharpened. If Cross stood here now, kneeling before symbols of the same hand that had carved into bark and bone, then the truth was undeniable. The murders weren't the work of a single drifter gone mad. They were part of something organized, deliberate, steeped in ritual and secrecy. The realization curdled in his stomach, but one truth cut through the horror, steady and cold. This goes deeper than one man, he breathed. This is a brotherhood of hunters. Elias spent the night pacing, the journal's imagined weight pressing against his chest, though it was not yet in his hands. The shrine's image haunted him. Sheriff Cross kneeling, whispering to symbols carved into stone as though pledging himself to something older than law. The detective's boots thudded a restless rhythm across the motel's wooden floorboards, each creak echoing the thought he could not shake. This was bigger than one man. He spread the Polaroids across the bedspread again, their faces staring back at him under the weak light of a desk lamp. Terror filled most of the eyes, but a detail gnawed at him. Some victims weren't looking at the camera at all. Their pupils tilted beyond the frame, gazes locked on something or someone lurking in the shadows when the pictures were taken. His throat tightened. The cult he imagined wasn't a theory anymore. The Brotherhood was real. At dawn, with no sleep to dull his determination, Elias wrapped himself in his coat and made for the courthouse archives. The air outside stung his face, brittle with frost, and the streets of Graypine lay silent, as though the town itself preferred ignorance to truth. Inside the archives, dust choked the stale air. He slid brittle papers across long tables, hunting names through faded ink and water stains. Property deeds, hunting licenses, land transfers. The pattern began to appear like veins on stone. Cabins scattered across Blackwater Valley, remote and forgotten, had once belonged to men of uniform. Retired rangers, deputies, even a coroner. Men who had supposedly faded into obscurity, disappearing quietly without explanation. Elias's pulse hammered. They hadn't disappeared. They had passed something down. One cabin stood out, its deed marked with a faded seal and an owner listed as unknown after 1989. The location, etched onto the paper, pointed deep into the valley's frozen timberland. He tucked the document into his coat and drove out, the tires crunching over brittle ice, the engine coughing as cold air pressed against the windshield. Hours later, the road collapsed into a forgotten track, half buried in snow. He abandoned the car and it continued on foot. Each step broke the crust of ice. Each breath turned the air into white fog. The forest closed around him, branches skeletal in the pale morning light. His gut warned him that what he was about to find would alter everything. The cabin revealed itself in silence, hunched under a quilt of snow, its roof sagging like a wounded beast. Elias's boots sank deep as he approached, his hand gripping the handle of his pistol, though no sound stirred. The door gave under his push, groaning against rusted hinges, and the stench hit him. Old copper, mold, something sour beneath. His flashlight's beam swept across a single room. Shadows clung to the corners. A table stood at the center, its wood darkened with ancient stains, blotches shaped like smears of fingers. He stepped closer, heart pounding, and his light revealed more. Symbols, the same jagged circles he'd seen carved into bark, were etched into the tabletop. The lines were gouged deep, filled with dried red that no season could wash away. His throat tightened as he saw the shackles. They dangled from the overhead beams, rusted but bent in unnatural ways, as though wrists had pulled against them until bones cracked. He reached up, fingertips brushing cold iron, imagining the cries that had once filled the cabin silence. His stomach turned, the metallic taste of dread coating his tongue. In that suffocating quiet, he whispered, "They brought them here." The sound of his own voice startled him. It felt wrong, as though he'd spoken in a tomb. Kneeling near the hearth, Elias pressed his hands against loose floorboards. One plank shifted under weight. He pried it up carefully, the nails screeching, revealing a cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in decaying cloth, lay a leather-bound journal. He pulled it free, brushing frost and dust away. The cover cracked under his fingers as he opened it. The handwriting was neat, disciplined, unmistakable. Sheriff Nathan Cross. His eyes raced across the first page, heart hammering louder with each word. The hunt purifies. The lake preserves. The cycle must continue. His breath caught, his hands trembling so hard the pages quivered. For a long moment, Elias simply stared, the silence of the cabin pressing in from every angle. Then rage surged through him, mingled with horror. This wasn't the rant of a madman who had lost his mind in the woods. This was order, control, doctrine. He slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing through the hollow cabin like a gunshot. Dust drifted down from the rafters. His chest heaved, vision swimming as he steadied himself against the table. He could feel every symbol in the room watching him, accusing him of intruding on something meant never to be uncovered. This wasn't just murder. It was ritual, and the Mullins had been sacrifices. The truck came out of nowhere, its high beams searing across the empty road like a wall of white fire. Elias jerked the wheel, but it was too late. The impact was a thunderous crack of metal and glass, the force hurling his car sideways into the ditch. The seatbelt bit into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, the world spun in fractured shards of light and screeching steel until silence dropped heavy, broken only by the hiss of the radiator. His hands shook as he clawed the buckle free. Cold night air rushed in through the shattered window, sharp with the scent of pine and gasoline. The groan of footsteps in the gravel told him he wasn't alone. Elias pushed the door open and staggered out, boots sinking in mud. Shapes emerged from the glare of headlights. 4, maybe 5 men, heavy coats pulled tight, masks carved in crude circles hiding their faces. One gripped a club, wrapped in tape, its end darkened with old stains. "You should have left, detective," a voice rasped, muffled by cloth. The words slithered across the night like a curse. The man with the club lunged. Instinct cut through the haze. Elias ducked low, his muscles screaming from the crash. The club whistled past his ear and cracked against the car door with a hollow clang. Elias drew his pistol in a single desperate motion. The trigger broke beneath his finger, the blast ripping through the quiet woods. A muzzle flash lit the trees for a heartbeat, scattering shadows. The attackers froze, startled by the echo of gunfire rolling across the valley. Then chaos erupted. One mask slipped askew in the rush, tumbling into the ditch. Elias's breath caught. The exposed face was unmistakable. Deputy Aaron Briggs, the sheriff's right hand, eyes wide with fury and fear. "Briggs," Elias whispered, half to himself, half in disbelief. The deputy's lips curled into a snarl. "Shoot him," someone shouted. Elias raised his weapon again, his hands trembling but steady enough to draw a bead on Briggs. For a moment, the two men stared across the headlights' glare. Hunter and hunted, authority and betrayal. But before Elias could fire, rough hands yanked Briggs backward. The others swarmed him, dragging him to the truck with frantic speed. Doors slammed, the engine roared, and the vehicle thundered down the road, vanishing into the dark forest with a spray of gravel. Silence returned, broken only by Elias's ragged breathing and the groan of his battered car, cooling in the ditch. He lowered the pistol slowly, realization sinking like ice through his veins. This wasn't a single madman. This was a circle, loyal men in masks, bound not by law but by the ritual he had glimpsed in the woods. Cross hadn't acted alone. He had soldiers. Elias staggered back to the car, gripping the frame for balance. His reflection stared back at him in the shattered mirror. Eyes wild, face streaked with dirt and blood. He had almost died, not from a wild ambush, but from men sworn to protect the same town he was trying to save. He forced the engine to life, coughing and sputtering, and limped the wreck of a vehicle back to the motel under a sky that seemed too still, too watchful. The door to his room stood ajar when he arrived. His pulse hammered in his ears. He stepped inside cautiously, gun raised. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool, as though someone had lingered too long in his space. The bedspread had been disturbed, its edges lifted like restless hands had pawed at it. He moved closer and froze. The Polaroids, every last one of them gone. The map he had laid out, the victims' faces, the evidence connecting everything. They had stripped it all away. In their place lay a single, fresh photograph, set carefully in the center of the pillow like a gift. Elias picked it up, his fingers numb. The image was grainy, black and white, but the subject was clear. It was him, standing in the woods earlier that day, his body turned toward the shrine, caught mid-step, his outline sharp against the trees, unaware of the eyes that framed him in the lens. A chill spread through his chest, heavier than the crash, heavier than the fight. They had been close enough to watch him, close enough to follow every move, close enough to break into his room and leave their calling card on the place where he rested his head. The photograph wasn't evidence. It was a message. His throat tightened, the whisper breaking from his lips before he could stop it. "Now I'm the prey," he whispered. The bones lay arranged on the steel table beneath the ultraviolet lamp, their pale curves glowing faintly, as if the dead themselves were whispering in secret light. Elias Ward stood rigid, his arms crossed tightly, the weight of dread pressing on his chest as he watched Dr. Marcus Hale move with steady, practiced precision. Marcus's gloved fingers traced along the ridges of the children's ribs, pausing as the faint lines shimmered under the glow. The detective's stomach turned. He had steeled himself for evidence of violence, but not for this. Tiny grooves carved like an artist's etching, deliberate and precise. Marcus leaned closer, his face grim beneath the lamp's eerie violet haze. "These aren't random scratches," he said, his voice low, heavy with certainty. "Look here, and here, repeated patterns, circular, jagged lines, exactly like the symbols you described in the forest." Elias leaned over, forcing himself to study what every part of him wanted to turn away from. The cuts weren't rough. They were meticulous, carved with purpose, as though the children had been transformed into canvases for the killer's ritual. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his face twitching. "They marked them," he said, his voice gravel. "Not just murdered them, offered them." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The room was silent, but for the faint hum of the lamp and the ticking of the wall clock. Elias shifted uneasily, unable to shake the sense that the children's bones had become more than remains. They were messages, carved warnings of something far darker than a single night of violence. Marcus set down the rib carefully, then turned toward another fragment, a femur smeared with old stains, brown and black where the marrow once lived. He scraped a thin sample into a vial and tested it under another scope. Minutes passed before he spoke again. "It isn't just human blood." He lifted his eyes, meeting Elias's. "This is layered, deer and human mixed together, as though someone painted it on them in stages. Like preparation." The words struck Elias like ice water. His mind painted the horror too vividly. A family forced into some twisted ceremony, doused in blood, mutilated before the killing blow. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as rage swelled inside him. They didn't just want to kill them. They wanted to use them, make them part of whatever madness they worshipped. His voice trembled with fury. Marcus stepped back, pulling off his gloves, his expression ashen. "This wasn't random slaughter, Elias. This was orchestrated, planned, carried out with a purpose that's been refined over time." His words fell like stones in the silence. Elias turned away from the table, struggling to keep his breathing even. He pressed a hand to his forehead, eyes burning. He had promised himself he wouldn't let emotion blind him, but the thought of Tyler and his brother enduring such torment clawed at his composure. He pictured Tyler's last note, scrawled in desperation, "He's here." The words echoed in his skull. Whoever he was, he hadn't acted alone. Later that evening, Elias trudged back to Lake Merrow, snow crunching beneath his boots, the bitter wind stinging his face. The lake spread before him like a slab of glass, its surface fractured with jagged veins of thawing ice. The world was still, yet every creak of shifting ice sounded like a whisper beneath his feet. Strapping on diving gear, he pushed into the freezing water, every nerve in his body screaming at the shock. His breath came hard through the mask, echoing loudly in his ears as he descended into the dark. The light on his helmet cut a narrow path through the murky depths, glinting off shifting strands of algae and the jagged outline of submerged branches. Then on the lake bed, something caught his beam, a shape not natural. A metal chest, half buried in silt, bound with chains that stretched like skeletal arms across the stones. Elias's heart hammered. Fighting the cold's bite, he wrestled with the chains until his gloves burned against the friction. At last, with one desperate pull, he dragged the chest free. Breaking the surface, he heaved the heavy box onto the shore, his breath steaming into the night air. His fingers shook as he pried the lock with his knife, every second stretching taut with dread. With a final snap, the lid gave way. Inside lay a grotesque archive of lives stolen. Driver's licenses curled with water damage, watches stiff with rust, wallets swollen with mold, photographs warped but unmistakable. Each belonged to someone who had vanished, names Elias had seen on reports, faces on missing posters long since yellowed with age. He dug deeper, hands trembling, finding more rings, pocket knives, keys, each a fragment of someone silenced. His throat constricted. "This isn't one family," he whispered aloud, the wind carrying his words over the still water. "This has been happening for decades." The realization settled on him with crushing weight. The Mullins weren't victims of chance, or even of one man's madness. They were simply the latest chosen for the ritual, swallowed by the same dark cycle that had claimed countless others. He sat back on the frozen ground, chest heaving, as the fire of fury mingled with the cold's bite. In his mind, he saw every family waiting for answers, every search that ended in silence. They had all been led here, to the same lake, to the same end. The Brotherhood's secret had been buried in ice, but the thaw had revealed its true depth. The Mullins weren't the only ones. They were just the most recent family to vanish into the Brotherhood's ritual. The office was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent light above Sheriff Cross's desk. He sat rigid in his chair, eyes locked on Elias with a stare that carried both authority and warning. His voice, when it came, was cold and sharpened like the edge of a blade. "You've dug too deep, detective. Leave this valley before you disappear like the rest." His hand rested deliberately on the desk, close to the revolver that always sat within reach. Elias didn't flinch. His breath came steady, but his jaw tightened as he slid the worn leather journal across the polished wood. It landed with a dull thud between them. "I know about your Brotherhood," he said, his tone low but steady, every word deliberate. His eyes locked on Cross's, searching for cracks in the mask. "I know about the shrine, and soon the world will too." For the briefest moment, Elias caught it, fear, raw and naked, flickering behind the sheriff's eyes. Cross's lips pressed into a hard line, his jaw twitching as if to clamp the truth inside. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose, forcing composure. "You're chasing shadows," Cross muttered, but his voice had lost its steadiness. His hand, once steady on the revolver, shifted away as though touching it might reveal too much. Elias stood, his boots echoing against the linoleum floor, and left without waiting for dismissal. He had what he needed, proof that Cross was afraid. Night draped itself over Graypine, the streets empty and slick with frost. The motel sat at the edge of town, its neon sign sputtering in the cold. Elias pulled into the lot, headlights washing over the thin layer of ice on the pavement. Marcus Hale was already waiting outside, hunched in his coat, a leather satchel clutched close to his side. His face was tense, eyes darting between the shadows. "You saw him?" Marcus asked quickly, voice hushed. "I saw enough," Elias replied, stepping out and pulling the journal from under his coat. He knows, and he's scared. That means we're close. Marcus nodded, though unease lingered in his eyes. Together, they climbed the creaking stairs to their room, the door hanging slightly ajar. Elias froze, his instincts snapping sharp. He held up a hand. Stay back. But Marcus shook his head, determination hardening his features. We can't hesitate now. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The world erupted. A crack and snap tore the silence as a wire triggered beneath Marcus's boot. The explosion thundered through the room, glass and flame bursting outward in a storm of shards and fire. The blast threw Elias backward into the railing, his ears ringing, chest seared by the shockwave. He hit the ground hard, vision swimming, the acrid scent of burning cloth and wood choking the air. Inside, the room was an inferno. The curtains roared with fire, splinters of furniture scattered across the floor. Marcus lay trapped beneath the collapsed frame of the bed, blood darkening his shirt in a spreading bloom. His breaths came shallow, ragged gasps swallowed by smoke. Elias crawled through the haze, dragging himself toward his friend. Marcus! His voice was hoarse, raw. He grasped the metal frame, straining, lifting just enough to see Marcus's pale face beneath. Marcus coughed, a weak smile tugging at his lips. His hand, trembling, reached into his coat pocket and pressed the ultraviolet light into Elias's palm. His voice was barely a whisper. End it. The weight of the device in Elias's hand felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. His throat tightened as he watched Marcus's chest heave once more, then still. The smoke curled around his body, swallowing him into silence. For a moment, Elias could do nothing but kneel, shaking with rage and grief. His fists clenched until his knuckles split. His friend was gone, murdered by Cross's hand, by the cult hiding in uniforms of law and order. Elias staggered to his feet, stumbling into the icy night air as flames consumed the room behind him. Outside, the motel parking lot was eerily still, the quiet broken only by the crackle of fire. Elias stood there, breath clouding in the cold, staring toward the line of the forest that loomed like a wall of black teeth on the horizon. His face was set, carved from anger and loss, his jaw locked tight. Now was war. The Brotherhood had revealed itself as a murderous cult hiding under the mask of law and order. Elias clenched his jaw, staring toward the black line of the forest. I'll burn it all before I let them hunt again. Elias moved through the trees with the UV light clenched tightly in his fist, his breath puffing in sharp clouds that dissolved into the cold night. Every step crackled against frozen leaves, echoing far too loudly in the stillness. The shrine rose ahead of him like a black scar in the forest, its jagged stones slick with frost, waiting. He slowed, shoulders tense, pulse hammering against his ribs. The weight of Marcus's dying words pressed on his chest, a reminder of why he was here. End it. Before Elias could take another step, shadows slipped from the tree-line. Dozens of them, figures cloaked in hunting coats, their masks carved with the same jagged circle that haunted every tree in the valley. Lantern light glinted against the crude etchings, making the masks look alive as though they sneered and grinned in the dark. The men moved with rehearsed precision, forming a semicircle around the shrine. The cold air stank of oil, sweat, and damp earth. At their center stood Sheriff Cross. His uniform hung loose beneath the heavy coat, but his posture was steady, proud. In one hand he carried a rusted lantern, its flame pulsing faintly, unnaturally, like a heart beating against the dark. His eyes caught the firelight, gleaming with both fury and conviction. You were never meant to find them, Cross said, his voice steady but edged with menace. The words cut through the silence. He lifted the lantern slightly, as though it were a holy object. The lake keeps our secrets. Elias's hand tightened on his pistol. He felt the cold steel dig into his palm as he raised it slowly, leveling it at Cross. But in that same moment, the firelight caught metal all around him. Rifles raised, barrels glinting, each man steady and unshaking. His throat dried. He counted at least 20. Even with perfect aim, he could never survive this standoff. Still, retreat was not an option. The forest seemed to breathe around him, the branches groaning as though the trees themselves watched the confrontation. Elias forced himself to think, his mind racing. He could see Marcus's bloodied face, hear his broken whisper. End it. He looked to the shrine, its stones jagged, cruel in design, black with years of hidden stains. Something gnawed at him. There was more here than firelight revealed. His thumb brushed the switch on the UV lamp. Cross smirked when he saw the flicker of hesitation. "You think you've uncovered anything?" he mocked, his tone smooth, almost taunting. "You've only scraped the surface. Men before you tried. They fed the lake the same way you will." He stepped forward, lantern swaying in his hand like a pendulum, the light stretching his shadow across the stones. "Put the gun down, Elias. End this with some dignity." Instead, Elias snapped the switch. The UV beam slashed across the shrine, flooding the stones with a violet glow. Gasps rippled through the masked men. Under the strange light, hidden stains blazed into view. Dark rivers soaked into the rock, splatters smeared like fingerprints of violence. Words carved into the stone, invisible before, now burned with crimson etchings. Hundreds of names. Names of men, women, and children. The shrine was no monument. It was a ledger of death. The sight rattled the hunters. Elias saw it in the way rifles wavered, in how shoulders stiffened. Some masks tilted, uncertain, as though the men behind them no longer recognized what they had served. The illusion of power cracked just enough. Elias's chest heaved as he stepped forward, forcing his voice to stay calm, though his heart raced. "This is what you worship," he said, his tone firm, cutting through the night. "Not tradition, not honor, just blood. Innocent lives carved into stone." For a heartbeat, silence ruled. Then Cross snarled, his mask of control slipping. "Lies!" His lantern shook in his hand, the flame inside flaring. "Do not listen. The cycle keeps this valley alive." His voice rose, cracking, desperate. "Without us, the forest consumes. The lake takes without purpose. We give it order. We give it meaning." Elias's mind sharpened with clarity. He knew fear when he heard it. Cross wasn't convincing them. He was trying to convince himself. He fired. The shot cracked like thunder, striking the lantern dead center. Glass exploded in a burst of sparks, and in an instant, fire roared outward, licking the dry brush and leaping onto the shrine. Flames spread hungrily, devouring pine needles and brittle wood. The heat punched Elias in the face as the blaze climbed skyward, orange and violet. Chaos erupted. The masked men stumbled back, rifles dropping as fire engulfed the clearing. Some turned and fled, their resolve broken by the sudden inferno. The sacred shrine they had bowed to was now nothing but a pyre, spitting embers into the black sky. Elias lunged forward, tackling Cross before he could regain control. They crashed against the burning stones, the sheriff's lantern fragments scattering underfoot. Cross grunted, his fists slamming into Elias's ribs, but Elias held on, his teeth clenched against the pain. The heat scalded his skin, smoke clawed his throat, but he forced Cross against the shrine with every ounce of strength. The sheriff's mask of authority shattered in the flames. His features twisted into raw fury, veins standing out in his neck, eyes blazing not with conviction, but with panic. Spittle flew from his lips as he spat the words, his voice breaking with rage. "You think this ends with me?" Elias drew the broken knife hilt from his coat, pressing it hard against the sheriff's throat. Smoke seared his lungs, the fire roared around them, but his voice was low, steady, and cold. "It ends tonight." The sheriff's last scream was swallowed by the blaze. By dawn, the valley glowed with the false light of fire and flood lamps. Smoke coiled from the blackened shrine, drifting low across the tree line like a shroud refusing to lift. Firefighters stomped through mud and ash, their boots sinking into the ruined clearing as they drowned what little flame remained. Federal reinforcements moved among them, rifles slung and eyes sharp, scanning the forest as though the shadows themselves might attack. The air smelled of burnt pine and something heavier, bone and blood baked into stone. Men shouted orders through the haze, but their voices were hollow, as if afraid to disturb the silence that pressed around them. In the center of the destruction, charred stones jutted upward like broken teeth. It was there the searchers found what was left of Sheriff Nathan Cross. His body was curled at the base of the altar, blackened beyond recognition, but his badge, fused into melted cloth, glinted faintly in the morning light. Elias Ward stood only a few feet away, his face pale against the smoke, his breath shallow. He stared at the ruin with a mixture of exhaustion and dread. The fire had ended one horror, but in its ashes lay evidence of many more. Deputies carried out small boxes lined with canvas. Inside, they placed bone fragments, brittle and gray, each one a quiet scream from the past. For every fragment pulled from the ashes, an investigator noted a name from a long-forgotten list of missing hikers and travelers. The tally grew, and with it, the weight pressing against Elias's chest. He rubbed at his temples, hearing Marcus's final words echo. Ended. But even as he looked on, he knew this ending was no ending at all. When federal officers questioned him, their pens scratched quickly, eager for sound bites that would fit a report. Elias's voice was flat, drained of fire, when he finally spoke. They called it the Brotherhood, he said, eyes fixed on the altar. His words were slow, deliberate, heavy with contempt. But it was just murder dressed as ritual. One of the agents glanced at him uneasily, as though fearing that saying the truth aloud might summon the dead. By mid-morning, news vans clogged the narrow road into Graypine. Satellite dishes tilted skyward, cameras rolled, and reporters pressed against barricades, their breath steaming in the cold air as they called out questions. Detective, is it true there were dozens of victims? What role did Sheriff Cross play? Are more suspects still at large? Their voices blended into one hungry roar. Elias avoided their eyes, his coat collar pulled high, his boots carrying him past the chaos without a word. He had no appetite for the world's curiosity. Families arrived soon after, drawn by headlines and whispers. Mothers and brothers clutched faded photographs, their hands trembling as they begged for answers. Some wept with relief when trinkets were identified, a watch, a wallet, a keychain rusted with time. Others screamed in rage, faces contorted as they demanded why no one had stopped the slaughter years before. The valley became a place of grief, each sob and shout sinking into the frozen earth. Elias watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling their pain lance through him, knowing he could offer no comfort. He had unearthed the truth, but truth was cruel, and it left wounds no justice could close. When the chaos overwhelmed him, he slipped away. Down by Lake Marrow, the spring thaw had begun. Ice cracked and groaned as water lapped gently against the shore, carrying with it the faint reflection of the morning sky. Elias stood with his hands deep in his coat pockets, shoulders bent against the wind. The lake seemed alive, shifting restlessly, as if it resented the secrets it had held for so long. He stared at its surface, watching pale light ripple where once the Mullins family had been entombed. His body ached, every bruise and cut reminding him of the cost of truth. Yet what tormented him most wasn't pain, but the image burned into his memory, the Polaroid he had studied by lamplight, the shadowed figure in the tree-line. Sheriff Cross had died in the fire, but that second outline remained unexplained, thin and sharp against the flicker of campfire light. Elias turned the question over and over in his mind. Who was the other man, and where was he now? The wilderness spread endlessly before him, trees swaying in the morning wind, their branches whispering secrets he couldn't decipher. The federal agents would write their reports, the media would move on, the families would grieve, but Elias knew better. He knew that shadows do not vanish just because one fire dies. Somewhere out there, another hunter still walked free, carrying the same creed, the same hunger. He drew his coat tighter around him, the cold biting through wool and cloth, his eyes never leaving the dark ridges of the valley. His breath came slow, visible, like a ghost escaping his lips. The world believed the nightmare ended with the shrine's flames, but Elias felt the truth pulse beneath his skin like a warning. He had ended one cycle, but not the darkness behind it. "The hunt isn't over," he whispered, as the lake shimmered with cold light one last time. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of murder, hidden evidence, and the haunting weight of long-buried secrets. Its purpose is to provoke suspense, raise awareness about the fragility of safety in even the most beautiful places, and inspire deeper thought about justice for victims whose stories are nearly forgotten.